In 1997, Johnny Depp sat across a table from Al Pacino in one of the most celebrated mob movies of the decade. Depp played an FBI undercover agent named Joe Pistone who had spent 6 years living inside the Bonanno crime family under the name Donnie Brasco. Pacino played Benjamin Ruggiero, Lefty Guns, the low-level street soldier who had vouched for Donnie Brasco, who had brought him inside, who had trusted him with his life, without ever knowing he was handing it to the FBI. The movie is good. It is genuinely good. The performances are real. The detail is largely accurate. The emotional core, the corrosive, damaging, morally ruinous weight of a man who has spent 6 years pretending to be someone he is not, lands with genuine power. And it shows you almost none of what actually happened, not the part where Joe Pistone came within a single phone call of being murdered, not the part where the FBI nearly pulled the entire operation because its own supervisors did not believe one man could actually be doing what he was doing, not the part where Pistone got so deep, so completely embedded in the actual daily operations of the Bonanno family, that the family's leadership voted to formally make him, to initiate him as a made member of La Cosa Nostra, which would have been either the greatest intelligence breakthrough in FBI history, or a death sentence, and for a long time nobody was entirely sure which. Not the part where at least 5 men were murdered, as a direct result of Donnie Brasco's presence inside the family. Men who were killed, not because of what they had done, but because of who they had been seen with. Not the part where, when it was over, when Joe Pistone finally came in from the cold, the Bonanno family put a $500 zero contract on his head, and that contract was never officially lifted. The movie gave you Johnny Depp and Al Pacino. Tonight we are going to show you what was actually there. If this is your first case file vault, welcome. This is exactly what we do every single week. We take the story you think you know from the movie, the documentary, the true crime podcast, and we go past it, into the files, into the testimony, into the documented record of what actually happened and what it actually cost. Hit subscribe right now so you do not miss what is coming. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see the Syndicate Files community from everywhere tonight. Like the video. Share it with someone who thinks they already know the Donnie Brasco story. Because I promise you, they do not know this version. Let's go. Part 1. The assignment nobody wanted in the summer of 1974. The FBI's Organized Crime Division in Newark had a problem that had been building for decades and was showing no signs of resolving itself. Despite 30 years of surveillance, despite Valachi's Senate testimony 11 years earlier, despite wiretaps and informants and millions of dollars of investigative resources, the Bureau had never successfully placed an undercover agent inside a functioning Newark crime family, never gotten a man through the door, into the rooms where decisions were made, into the conversations that the surveillance microphones could not reach. The problem was structural. The 5 families were not merely suspicious of strangers. They had a formal protocol, the introduction system, the friend of ours versus friend of mine distinction, specifically designed to make infiltration impossible. A man could not simply appear and claim to be connected. He had to be vouched for by someone who was already inside, and the men inside had taken an oath, on pain of death, never to vouch for anyone they did not know with absolute certainty. The theoretical solution was obvious. Get a man in front of someone on the fringes of the organization. Let him build a relationship slowly, from the outside in, earning trust at each level before moving deeper. Let him become, over time, so useful and so familiar that the introduction happened naturally, organically, not because someone had decided to trust him, but because they had simply stopped thinking of him as an outsider. The practical problem was time. A process like that, if it worked at all, would take years. And an undercover agent operating for years in that environment without a single mistake, without a single moment of exposure, without a single slip that could get him killed. That was not a mission. That was a theoretical exercise. Joseph P. Stone was 32 years old when he walked into his supervisor's office and said he thought he could do it. He had grown up in a New Jersey neighborhood where the men his reference was not exotic or intimidating. It was simply the background noise of the community. He knew the slang. He knew the customs. He knew the specific texture of a world that most FBI agents could only approximate from the outside. He had worked undercover before on smaller operations and had discovered something about himself that was either a gift or a psychological peculiarity. Depending on how you looked at it, he was extraordinarily good at becoming someone else, not at pretending to be someone else, at actually, functionally, in the day-to-day operational sense, becoming a different person. His supervisors approved the operation with significant reservations and a time limit, 6 months. They would give him 6 months to penetrate the organization to a useful depth. If he had not produced actionable intelligence by then, they would pull him out. Joe P. Stone spent the next 6 years inside. Part 2. Building Donnie Brasco before P. Stone could walk into a room full of organized crime figures. He had to build a legend, a false identity complete enough to withstand scrutiny from men who had spent their lives reading other men for deception. The identity he constructed was Donald Brasco, Donnie Brasco, a jewel thief and fence, a man who moved stolen goods, who had connections to criminal operations in other cities, who was good with his hands and reliable with his mouth. The jewelry cover was deliberate. It gave him a reason to have cash, a reason to travel, a reason to know people in multiple cities, and most critically, a reason to be useful to men who were always looking for someone who could move stolen merchandise quickly and quietly. P. Stone spent months before the operation began building the infrastructure of Donnie Brasco's existence. He learned the jewelry trade in enough technical detail to pass close examination. He established relationships under the Brasco identity with people on the fringes of the criminal world who did not know he was FBI and who could, if anyone checked, confirm that they had known Donnie Brasco for years. He created a paper trail, a life with enough texture and history that a suspicious man asking questions would find answers that held up. And then, in late 1976, through a carefully managed series of introductions, Donnie Brasco walked into a bar on the west side of Manhattan called the Holiday Cocktail Lounge, a known hangout for members and associates of the Colombo and Bonanno crime families, and ordered a drink. What the movie captures reasonably well is what happened next. P. Stone's initial contacts were not senior Mafia figures. They were exactly the kind of men you would expect to encounter in that environment: street level associates, small-time criminals, men who were connected to the families without being made members, men who were useful but not trusted at the highest levels. P. Stone was patient in a way that the movie compresses but cannot fully convey. He did not push. He did not try to accelerate his way up the chain. He showed up. He was reliable. He was good at what Donnie Brasco was supposed to be good at. He made money for the people around him. He solved problems. He was, in the parlance of the world, a good earner. And a good earner who kept his mouth shut and did not create problems was the most valuable thing any crime family could have. The relationship with Benjamin Ruggiero, Lefty Guns, that forms the emotional center of the movie, began in this period. Lefty was, by the mid-1970s, a man who had spent decades inside the Bonanno family without ever rising above the rank of soldier. He was a killer. He claimed 30 murders, a number that investigators found credible. But he had never accumulated the kind of wealth or status that his years of service might have suggested he deserved. He was in the brutal arithmetic of the organization, a man whose value was primarily operational. He pulled triggers. He did not make decisions. What Lefty Ruggiero recognized in Donnie Brasco was not just a useful associate. It was an opportunity. If he brought a good earner into the family, if he vouched for someone who proved himself reliable and valuable, it reflected well on him. It was, potentially, his path to the recognition he had been chasing for 30 years. He vouched for Donnie Brasco, and with that vouch, with those 3 words, "This is a friend of mine," Joe Pistone walked through the door of the Bonanno crime family and the operation changed completely. Part 3. The weight of the vouch. The movie explains the vouch in a way that is technically accurate and emotionally true, but does not fully convey its operational implications for Joe Pistone's survival. When Lefty Ruggiero vouched for Donnie Brasco, he was not merely introducing him to his friends. He was staking his life on Donnie Brasco's trustworthiness. That was not a metaphor. It was the literal operational reality of the introduction system. If Donnie Brasco turned out to be an informant, a thief, a cop, a federal agent, if he turned out to be anything other than exactly what Lefty said he was, Lefty Ruggiero would be held responsible, not embarrassed, not demoted, killed. The man who vouched for a federal agent inside La Cosa Nostra did not get to explain himself. He did not get a hearing. He was killed because the vouch was the guarantee, and if the guarantee proved false, the only possible response, the only response that preserved the integrity of the system, was the death of the man who had given it. Pistone understood this from the moment it happened, every day that he continued the operation. He was not merely risking his own life. He was, in a very direct and personal sense, contributing to the circumstances that would eventually get Lefty Ruggiero killed. The man who had trusted him, the man who had become, in the 6 years of the operation, something that Pistone later described with visible difficulty in interviews, not a friend, exactly, because Donnie Brasco was not real and the friendship was built on a lie, but something genuine. A relationship that had cost both men more than either of them could have anticipated. This is the emotional truth the movie does capture. What it cannot fully capture is the operational reality that surrounded it every day. Because as Pistone went deeper, as Donnie Brasco moved from associate to trusted insider, from the fringes of the organization to its operational core, the danger did not decrease as he became more familiar. It increased. More familiarity meant more knowledge. More knowledge meant more people who needed to believe the lie. More people who needed to believe the lie meant more exposure. More exposure meant more chances for a single wrong word, a single inconsistency, a single person from Pistone's real life appearing at the wrong moment in the wrong place. And there was something else the movie glosses over almost entirely. The things Donnie Brasco was required to do to maintain his cover. Part 4. What the cover required. The Donnie Brasco operation is sometimes described as a passive intelligence gathering mission. An agent who went inside, listened, observed, and reported. That description is almost entirely wrong. Pistone was not a passive observer. He was an active participant in the criminal enterprise of the Bonanno family. He could not be anything less. A man who was present at meetings but never participated, who was trusted with plans but never contributed to them, who was given opportunities to demonstrate his reliability but always found reasons to avoid following through. That man would have been identified as a problem within weeks, possibly days. Pistone was required to commit crimes, real crimes, not simulated, not staged, not documented in advance with FBI authorization, crimes that happened, that had victims, that caused real harm to real people. He participated in burglaries. He moved stolen merchandise. He was present for, and in some cases actively involved in operations that the FBI could not fully document or control in advance, because documenting them in advance would have required disclosing the operation to people who could not be trusted to keep it secret. He was present when violence was discussed. He was present when specific men were identified as targets. He was present in rooms where murder was planned. And he could not, without blowing his cover and almost certainly being killed on the spot, do anything to stop it. This is the dimension of the Donnie Brasco operation that its retrospective celebration almost entirely obscures. Pistone was not just gathering intelligence on the Bonanno family. He was, for 6 years, functionally a member of it. He attended the meetings. He got his share of the earnings. He participated in the operations. The FBI's position, then and now, is that everything P. Stone did was authorized, that the Bureau maintained oversight of the operation throughout, and that the intelligence produced justified the methods required to obtain it. Joe P. Stone's own accounts of the operation are somewhat more complicated than that official position. He has described moments of genuine uncertainty about where the line was. He has described the psychological experience of inhabiting Donnie Brasco so completely, for so long, that the question of what Joe P. Stone would have done in a given situation became genuinely difficult to answer, because Joe P. Stone had not been fully present for years. Part 5. The 5 murders. The movie shows you one death that is directly connected to Donnie Brasco's presence inside the family. It handles it with appropriate gravity. It treats it as the moral weight that it was. The real number was at least 5. As P. Stone went deeper into the Bonanno family, his presence and the associations that presence created had consequences that neither he nor the FBI could fully control or anticipate. The first murders connected to the operation occurred not because anyone suspected Donnie Brasco, but because of the turbulent internal politics of the Bonanno family, the same family that had never fully recovered from the Banana War of the 1960s, that had been expelled from the commission, that was riven with faction and suspicion at every level. Men who were associated with the wrong faction, men who were in the wrong place when P. Stone was present and whose presence in that place was later interpreted as suspicious by paranoid bosses, looking for explanations for problems that had nothing to do with the FBI. Men who were killed, in some cases, because of decisions that flowed downstream from information P. Stone had collected and reported information that the FBI had acted on in ways that created consequences inside the family that the family then blamed on people who had no idea what had actually happened. The most direct case was the murder of Dominic Napolitano, Sonny Black, the Bonanno capo who had become P. Stone's primary patron in the later years of the operation. When the operation ended and Donnie Brasco's identity was revealed, Sonny Black understood immediately what had happened. He understood that he had vouched for a federal agent. He understood what the rules said about the man who vouched for a federal agent. He reportedly told associates to tell his family he was sorry. He reportedly handed over his jewelry and personal effects before the meeting where he was killed, because he knew he was not coming back from it, and he wanted someone to have his things. His body was found months later. His hands had been cut off. In the language of mob violence, that was the specific message sent to a man who had reached out to the wrong person, whose hands had made a gesture of trust that proved to be a death sentence for everyone around him. Sonny Black was not an innocent man. He had ordered murders. He had run criminal operations. He was, by any legal or moral measure, exactly the kind of man the Donnie Brasco operation was designed to expose and prosecute. He was also a man who had believed in Donnie Brasco, who had protected him, who had trusted him in the deepest way that the rules of his world permitted trust, and his hands were cut off because of it. Lefty Ruggiero was arrested before the family's internal judgment could reach him. He was convicted on racketeering charges and sentenced to prison. He died of cancer in 1994 in the witness protection adjacent obscurity of a man who had outlived his world without being allowed back into it. He served his sentence. He did not cooperate. Right to the end, Lefty followed the rules. Part 6. The near misses. There were at least 3 moments during the 6 years of the Donnie Brasco operation when Joe P. Stone came close enough to exposure that the operation could reasonably have ended with his death rather than his extraction. The movie dramatizes one of them. The moment when a suspicious member of the family begins asking questions that Donnie Brasco's cover story cannot fully answer. It handles it as a single tense scene. In reality, that kind of scrutiny was not a single scene. It was an ongoing condition of the operations later years. The first near miss came early, before P. Stone had been formally introduced to Bonanno family members. A criminal figure he had been cultivating as an entry point into the organization became suspicious, not of P-Stone's FBI identity, but of a discrepancy in the Donnie Brasco legend. A date that did not quite add up. A name that, when checked, produced a slightly different story than P-Stone had told. It was the kind of small inconsistency that, in a normal social environment, would be dismissed as a memory error or a misunderstanding. In the environment P-Stone was operating in, small inconsistencies were the first warning signs of a man who was not what he claimed. P-Stone spent 3 days managing that single discrepancy, explaining, recontextualizing, producing corroborating details, while simultaneously preparing, in the back of his mind, for the possibility that he might need to get out very quickly. The second near miss was more serious in the later years of the operation. A senior Bonanno figure with connections to other families began making inquiries about Donnie Brasco through channels that P-Stone could not monitor or control. The inquiry reached someone who knew something that did not match the Brasco legend in a way that the FBI could not fix from the outside. P-Stone learned about the inquiry through his own sources inside the organization. One of the genuinely remarkable aspects of how deep his penetration had gone, and managed to get ahead of it. But the window between when he learned about the problem and when it might have produced a lethal conclusion was narrow enough that his supervisors at the Bureau seriously considered pulling him out. They did not. The intelligence being produced was too valuable. The operation continued. The third near miss was the most dangerous, and it is almost entirely absent from the movie. By 1981, P-Stone had become close enough to the senior leadership of the Bonanno family that a conversation began, a serious, operational conversation, not a hypothetical, about formally initiating Donnie Brasco as a made member of La Cosa Nostra. The logic, from the family's perspective, was straightforward. Brasco had been around for years. He was reliable. He was a good earner. He had been trusted with sensitive operations and had never created a problem. The people who had vouched for him were confident in him. Making him was the natural next step. From Joe P-Stone's perspective, it was the most terrifying development of the entire operation. Part 7. The question of initiation. The FBI faced a decision in late 1981 that had no precedent and no obvious right answer. If Donnie Brasco was initiated into La Cosa Nostra, if the ceremony happened, if he took the oath, if he became, in the organization's formal accounting, a made member, the intelligence implications were extraordinary. A fully initiated FBI agent inside the Bonanno family, trusted at the level that made membership conferred, would have access to information that no surveillance operation had ever come close to producing. He would be in the room for the real conversations, not the conversations that happened in front of trusted associates. The conversations that happened between made members only, the ones where the actual decisions were made, where the actual orders were given, where the actual structure of the organization was visible in its full detail. The counter-arguments were severe. The initiation ceremony required a murder, not historically, not symbolically, an actual murder committed by the initiate, as proof of commitment and as the guarantee that bound him to silence through his own criminal liability. The FBI could not authorize an agent to commit murder as a condition of maintaining cover. That was not a legal gray area. That was a line that did not move. There was also the question of what it would mean, legally and institutionally, for a federal agent to swear an oath to a criminal organization, to formally, ceremonially, commit himself to placing the organization above all other loyalties, including, by explicit terms of the oath, his loyalty to law enforcement. The FBI pulled the operation before the initiation could happen. On July 26, 1981, after nearly 6 years undercover, Joe P-Stone was extracted. Donnie Brasco ceased to exist. The operation was over, and within days, the Bonanno family began trying to understand what had happened. Part 8, The Aftermath. Nobody shows. The movie ends with P-Stone's extraction and a title card noting the convictions that followed. It gives you the numbers, over 200 indictments, over 100 convictions, and then it ends. What it does not show you is what happened next to Joe Pistone. The Bonanno family, once they understood the full extent of what Donnie Brasco had been, responded in the only way their rules permitted. They put a contract on him, $500,000 for the death of Joe Pistone, the largest known contract placed on a federal agent in American history at that time. Pistone went into a version of protective custody that was not quite witness protection. He was, after all, not a witness in the traditional sense, but an agent whose testimony was central to dozens of prosecutions, but was something close to it. In its practical effect, he moved. He moved again. His family moved. His wife and children relocated and relocated again. For years after the operation ended, the question of whether someone would eventually decide that $500,000 was worth the risk of trying to collect it was not a theoretical concern. It was the condition under which he lived. The prosecutions that followed the Donnie Brasco operation were among the most significant in the history of the FBI's war against organized crime. Pistone testified in case after case, in city after city. His testimony was not merely evidence of specific crimes. It was a guided tour of the internal operations of La Cosa Nostra, delivered by a man who had spent 6 years inside it, who knew the protocols and the personalities and the specific ways in which the organization functioned at its operational core. The Bonanno family, already the most damaged of the 5 families from decades of internal warfare. An FBI infiltration never fully recovered. The combination of Pistone's intelligence and the prosecutions it generated produced a leadership vacuum that the family spent years unable to fill. Bosses who were convicted were replaced by acting bosses who were convicted in turn. The organization that had once been one of the 5 pillars of the commission became, through the 1980s and 1990s, the most troubled and least functional of the New York families. And through all of it, through the trials and the convictions and the years of testimony, Joe Pistone continued to operate under his real name, which meant the contract remained active, which meant the threat remained real. Part 9. The psychological cost of the movie handles the psychological dimension of the Donnie Brasco operation better than most depictions of undercover work. It takes seriously the question of what 6 years of sustained identity suppression does to a person. It shows the damage to Pistone's marriage, the estrangement from his children, the difficulty of re-entry into a normal life. What it cannot fully show, because it is a 2-hour movie and not a decade of lived experience, is the specific, documented, deeply strange aftermath that Pistone himself has described in interviews and in his written accounts. He had trouble being Joe Pistone, not in the dramatic, dissociative sense of a man who had lost his grip on reality, in the more mundane and perhaps more disturbing sense of a man who had inhabited another identity for so long, so completely, so successfully, who had made Donnie Brasco real enough that the Bonanno family had voted to initiate him, that returning to the original self required active effort in a way that it should not have. He found himself, in the months after the operation ended, responding to social situations with Donnie Brasco's reflexes rather than his own, assessing rooms the way Brasco would have assessed them, relating to people through the lens of the criminal world's trust calculus, rather than normal social intuition, catching himself about to make a reference that Brasco would have made, before remembering that Brasco was gone and he was Joe again. His marriage did not survive the operation. The years of absence, not just physical absence, but the particular absence of a man who was present in body but had sent a different person to fill his place, had done damage that could not be repaired by the operation's end. The FBI, which had benefited enormously from what Pistone had been willing to do and to become, provided a debrief, a commendation, and a relocation budget. It did not provide anything resembling adequate psychological support for the specific kind of identity damage that 6 years as Donnie Brasco had produced. That infrastructure simply did not exist. The Bureau had never done this before. It had no protocol for extracting a man from the deepest undercover operation in its history and helping him find his way back to himself. P-Stone found his own way, slowly, imperfectly. But he found it, the darkest fact the movie never shows. Johnny Depp's Joe P-Stone is a fundamentally sympathetic figure. He is a man doing a difficult and dangerous job of skill and reluctant courage, paying a personal cost that the audience is invited to recognize and honor. The real Joe P-Stone is more complicated than that. Not because he was dishonest or cowardly or corrupt. He was none of those things. But because the operation he ran produced consequences that the movie, by focusing on the personal and the emotional, does not fully account for. 5 men died, not abstractions. 5 specific human beings who, whatever their crimes, were killed in circumstances that were shaped in part by P-Stone's presence inside the organization and the turbulence that presence created. Dozens of men were convicted on the basis of his testimony that was genuine and documented and legally sound, but that also represented the product of 6 years of deeply intimate deception. Men who had shared meals with Donnie Brasco, who had trusted him, who had told him things they would never have said to anyone they believed to be an outsider. And the operation itself, the method of it, the depth of it, the willingness to place an agent so far inside a criminal organization that the organization voted to make him a member, established a precedent and a template for undercover work that raised questions the FBI and the Justice Department are still wrestling with today. Questions about what an undercover agent can be permitted to do, about where the line is between gathering evidence and participating in crime, about the difference between infiltrating a criminal organization and, for a long enough period, actually being one. Joe P-Stone answered all of those questions the way he answered most things, pragmatically, operationally, with the cool assessment of a man who understood what the mission required and was willing to do. Whether those were the right answers is a question the movie does not ask. Joe P-Stone is still alive. He is in his 80s. He has written books, given lectures, consulted on films and television shows, and spent decades as the most famous undercover agent in American law enforcement history. He does not use his real name in public settings when he can avoid it. He remains aware of his physical surroundings in the specific, habitual way of a man who spent 6 years in an environment where inattention could be fatal. Old habits, he has said in interviews, do not entirely leave you. The $500,000 contract, whether it remains technically active or has been superseded by time and the collapse of the organization that issued it, is a question he tends to answer with the same flat, undramatic pragmatism that characterizes his public persona. He does not pretend it does not exist. He does not pretend it keeps him up at night. He treats it the way he treats most things, as a fact of his life that he has learned to navigate, rather than a threat that he is willing to let define him. Benjamin Ruggiero, Lefty Guns, died in 1994. He served his sentence. He did not cooperate. He died following the rules of an organization that had already been largely dismantled by the testimony of the man he had vouched for, in a world that no longer existed in the form he had known it. Dominic Napolitano, Sonny Black, died without his hands. The Bonanno family survived, in diminished and damaged form, into the 21st century. It was penetrated again, repeatedly, by subsequent FBI operations that used the template P-Stone had created. Each penetration produced more convictions. Each conviction produced more cooperators. Each cooperator produced more intelligence that made the next penetration easier. The operation that Joe P-Stone ran did not merely produce 100 indictments. It demonstrated that the Commission's most fundamental security assumption, that the introduction system, the vouch, the oath, the web of mutual surveillance and mutual trust, was penetrable. That a man with the right skills, the right preparation, and a willingness to sustain a deception across years and relationships, and genuine human connection could walk through the door. that was supposed to keep the outside world out. Once that was demonstrated, it could not be undemonstrated. The door was never as secure again. The movie gave you 2 hours of Johnny Depp learning to be a wise guy, and Al Pacino being heartbreaking as the man who trusted him. The reality gave you 6 years of a man who became so convincingly someone else that the most paranoid criminal organization in American history voted to make him one of their own. 5 men dead, a marriage destroyed, a $500,000 contract that never officially expired, and a psychological aftermath that the FBI had no protocol to address because it had never done anything like this before and did not fully understand what it had asked its agent to become. The Real Donnie Brasco Operation was not a 2-hour movie. It was a slow, patient, irreversible dismantling of the most important security system the American Mafia had ever built, conducted from the inside, over 6 years, by one man, and the full cost of it was paid not just in convictions, but in the specific, human, uncinematic weight of everything it required him to do to get there. If you made it here, if you were with me from that cold open all the way to this moment, hit subscribe right now. This is the Syndicate Files. Every week we go exactly this deep, exactly this far past the version you already thought you knew. Subscribe, notifications on, share this one, and drop a comment below. What did you know about the Real Donnie Brasco Operation before tonight? What surprised you most? I read every single one. The Case File Vault. The truth is always more dangerous than the movie.